All right. Well, welcome everyone. Thank you for joining us this afternoon for the Summer Recreation Season Preview webinar hosted by the Iowa Environmental Council. So for today, this is our agenda. I'm going to talk a little bit about who the Iowa Environmental Council is. I'm going to provide some background on Iowa's river and lake recreation, as well as water quality and public health risks. Talk a little bit about what you can do, and then we will move into our panel discussion with our guest panelists, and we'll have time for Q&A at the end. So I am Alicia Basto. I'm the Water Program Associate Director with the Iowa Environmental Council. I'm going to be presenting the first portion of this event, some of the background information, and then I'm going to turn it over to Ingrid Gronsdahl, our Water Program Director, to moderate the panel discussion. So a little bit of background on the Iowa Environmental Council for those of you who may not be familiar with us. We are a 501c3 nonprofit organization. We work on water, land, climate, and energy law and policy issues here in Iowa. We have two major program areas, our energy and climate program and our clean water and land stewardship program. And Ingrid and I are with the Clean Water and Land Stewardship Program. And this webinar is part of our Iowa Water Watch project. So Iowa Water Watch is kind of our outreach arm related to water recreation and outdoor public land use. So you can find all of the information that I'm going to present on today at the landing page for Iowa Water Watch, iaenvironment.org/IWW, and other information if you're interested in learning more. There's a lot of really great resources there. I also want to thank the Mississippi River Network for supporting Iowa Water Watch and this webinar. The Mississippi River Network is a coalition of organizations up and down the Mississippi River that work on protecting the river, and IEC has been a member of that coalition for a long time, and so we're really grateful for their support. All right, so Iowa's river and lake recreation. I just wanted to give a little bit of background data for folks to understand some of the importance of why we talk about this subject and why we think many Iowans should care about it. And this is primarily from an economic perspective. Obviously, there's a lot of reasons to love our rivers and lakes. They provide habitat, quality of life, amenities, and health benefits, and can also be sources of drinking water. But from an economic perspective, they're also hugely important to our state. So this data is actually pretty old. They haven't updated the river valuation data in about a decade. So this is from like 2009, 2010 timeframes. So you can imagine that some of this is actually a lot more than it used to be. But at that time, river recreation was found to create more than $800 million in sales for our state, supported more than 6,000 jobs. The most popular river segments in Iowa to recreate on were on the Mississippi River, Des Moines River, and Cedar Rivers. And water quality and habitat was chosen as the second most important factor for people when they were choosing a river to visit for recreation. That was after proximity being the most important factor for folks. So this data is from CARD. It's the Center for Ag and Rural Development at Iowa State University. They did this study. They also did the Lakes Valuation project, which we have more recent data from. This data is from 2019. They most recently updated this. So Iowa Lake Recreation brings in more than $1 billion to Iowa's economy annually, creates and supports more than 12,000 jobs. Iowans really frequently use our lakes in the summer. 60% of Iowans visit a state lake at least once per year. And in this survey, water quality was found to be the most important factor when choosing a lake for recreation, even more so than proximity. CARD also did a study a few years ago that found that Iowans would be willing to pay $30 million more per year on recreation if water quality was actually improved in the state. So water quality is a big factor for visitors. We're going to talk a little bit about water quality and impacts on public health. So the main thing that we pay attention to for the sake of Iowa Water Watch is our beach advisories. So every summer, the Iowa DNR tests state public park beaches weekly for E. coli and microcystin at 39 state park beaches. And they publish that data and we report it out in Weekly Water Watch. We also get information from the Army Corps of Engineers. They do monitoring. The Rock Island District does monitoring at 5 beaches at 3 reservoirs at Sailorville, Coralville, and Lake Red Rock. So they do their monitoring in the same methodology as the DNR, and they report out those beach advisories, and we report that out as well. So that weekly monitoring takes place from Memorial Day weekend to Labor Day weekend every summer. And that's when we send out the weekly emails with the beach advisories. So that's our primary source of information for water quality and public health concerns related to water recreation. So what are they actually monitoring? One thing is E. coli. So E. coli is a kind of fecal coliform bacteria. So E. coli indicates when there's fecal matter in the water. And so some strains of E. coli itself can cause negative health outcomes, can cause diarrhea or respiratory infections if you're swallowing it. But E. coli is also used as an indicator of other pathogens that might be present in the water. So if there's fecal contamination, there could be other kinds of pathogens that could be harmful to human health. So E. coli is what is measured as kind of the best way to see if there's a possibility of other pathogens. But we are also concerned about what those other pathogens are and the other kinds of health outcomes that they could cause. So the E. coli can be present from fecal contamination that comes from manure spills and runoff when manure is used as fertilizer on farm fields and that runs off the fields into the waterways. It can also come from septic systems and sewage treatment plants or from wildlife, pets, or even small children with leaky diapers that can all contaminate the water and indicate presence of E. coli. So the swim advisories are issued under 2 different parameters. Basically, when there's one really high measurement of E. coli, or if there's a longer term presence of E. coli, they will issue swim advisories for that. So we've been tracking how many advisories are issued for E. coli every summer at our state park beaches. This is the DNR data. And, we don't really see much of a trend here, except that it's pretty standard. It is unchanging and a pretty regular occurrence here in our state. But there are some beaches that are have more chronic issues with E. coli, particularly Backbone Lake, which is at Backbone State Park, our state's oldest state park. That beach has E. coli advisories just about every week of the year for the last few summers. Beads Lake is another one, and McIntosh Woods Beach at Clear Lake, they have a lot of E. coli advisories. So what is the other thing that's being measured? That is microcystin. So microcystin is the toxin that's created by harmful algae blooms, which occur when there's excess nutrients in the water, primarily nitrogen and phosphorus, that are applied often as fertilizers. And then the excess gets into the water, it causes an algae bloom, and that algae can produce the microcystin. So this typically forms in warm, stagnant waters. And the microcystins can also indicate the presence of other kinds of toxins that are being produced by the algae blooms. But microcystin is typically what's measured. And microcystin itself is pretty nasty stuff if you come into contact with it. Even your skin contact, it can cause rashes and hives. If you inhale it, like in water droplets, if you're boating or water skiing or something like that, it can give you respiratory issues. If you swallow it, it can cause, stomach pain and vomiting and diarrhea, and other flu-like symptoms. And chronic exposure can be really, really damaging to your liver. So swim advisories for microcystin are issued when it is found at 8 micrograms per liter or higher on our state park beaches. So one of the other things that we like to point out related to microcystin is that it can be really damaging to dogs, to pets. So this might be something that people don't really think about, but they take their dog for a nice play day at the lake, let them go splash around and play in the water. They might drink the water, they might lick it off of their fur and ingest a lot more of it than, a human typically would. And that can lead to dog deaths. And we see these headlines usually a few times each year. So it's just something to really be aware of. It's just a really sad thing to hear about, if people just aren't aware that this is a risk for their pets especially. So what are the causes of this pollution that is leading to the algae blooms? Well, it's primarily from agricultural fertilizer and livestock manure that is applied as fertilizer. That, when it's in excess, can run off of farm fields into our waterways. Nitrogen and phosphorus can also come from stormwater runoff, wastewater discharges, or again, from wildlife or pet waste. So these are what we've seen for microsystem advisories over the years, generally kind of an upward trend, but obviously you can see a lot of variability here. This is also a little bit skewed because prior to 2020, DNR was only issuing advisories for microcystin at 20 micrograms per liter and above, and they introduced this more protective threshold in 2020, the 8 micrograms per liter. So if they had been using an 8 microgram per liter threshold in 2019, there would have been 15 more advisories that year than there were. So we're really glad that they're using this more protective threshold and providing more information for folks as they go out to try to recreate and gauge the risk. And again, some beaches have more issues with microcystin and harmful algae blooms than others. Green Valley Lake here is obviously pretty outstanding in terms of that. But all of these lakes are just the ones that had 5 or more advisories during this time frame. But you can see the full list on our Water Watch website if you would like to check that out for the other lakes. Then just to briefly touch on flowing water risks, there's some differences with flowing water versus lake recreation, which is often what we focus on. But for flowing water, there is still some concern for these same contaminants and pollutants that I just mentioned, especially in slow moving water or water that is kind of pooling. So this photo is actually from Cedar Creek, which flows into Cedar Lake down near Winterset. And obviously it has a really large algae bloom here because it's a very slow moving creek. So when you're, recreating on flowing water, you usually in a boat. And so the risks are not, necessarily the same with these kinds of contaminants. But if you tip over, if you, splash the water on yourself, there are some of these same health risks associated with microcystins and E. coli or other pathogens. There are also other things to consider when you're recreating on flowing water, like different kinds of hazards, tree branches, clumps of debris and stuff that can form and can snag you. Also being really aware of the water level and the flow of the water, especially if you're not a very experienced paddler. Don't go out on an unfamiliar river when the water is really high, because that can be really dangerous. So just being aware of all those different kinds of factors when you're heading out to recreate this summer is really important. So what can you do if you're interested in getting more involved on these issues? We encourage you to get more involved with IEC. I'm sorry if you can hear these sirens outside the window here, it's very loud. But we encourage you to talk to your legislators about these issues. Let them know that you care about recreation and risks to public health associated with our water quality. We have a great legislative portal with a lot of tools that you can use, but obviously the legislative session just ended literally yesterday for this year, but it's always still a good idea to talk to your elected officials about these issues. You'll also be receiving, now that you've registered with us, you'll get our action alerts in your emails where you can take timely actions on stuff related to water issues. Come to our events, join us for advocacy opportunities, and then of course support IEC by joining as a member or as a donor. We always appreciate that. A great opportunity to be a donor is to join us for Pro H2O on June 9th. This is our largest fundraising event of the year, and we're hosting events in Okoboji, Des Moines, and Iowa City, but we are also doing a live stream. So please join us. It'll be a lot of fun, music, food and beverage. So a really good time to come and talk with us about water issues. If you're interested in the Natural Resources and Outdoor Recreation Trust Fund, you're welcome to join us in our Coalition for Fund the Trust. This is really focused on public outreach about the trust fund, or IWIL. Some of you may have heard of it. So if you're interested in that specific issue, please reach out. We also really encourage you to write an op-ed or a letter to the editor related to these issues. So especially right now at the start of the recreation season, this is a really good time to draw attention to water recreation. And so we've created some tools to help you out. If you're interested, please go to iaenvironment.org/LTE toolkit. We also have some draft copy written that you can look at for inspiration or adapt to make your own. And we posted that at iaenvironment.org/waterLTE. And if you're interested in writing a letter to the editor and you want some help writing it or getting it placed anywhere, please reach out to us. We are very happy to help you in those efforts. And then lastly, you can join the Mississippi River Network as a river citizen. So you can sign up online and get involved with that organization and help protect the river and learn more about more regional river activities as well. So that's it for the initial presentation here. So I'm going to pass it over to Ingrid to kick off our panel discussion and introduce our panelists.
Great, thanks Alicia, and thanks for that intro presentation. I'll go ahead and let the panelists introduce themselves, and I'll go in alphabetical order by last name here. So Michael, do you want to start off?
The curse and the blessing of having an A and starting my last name with an A, although I did recently marry and I'm now a King Anderson, but I haven't made it legal. So anyways, hey all, Michael Anderson. I'm the Outreach and Engagement Manager with the Mississippi River Network. Alicia has been sharing more about MRN during this webinar. I'm going to quick share that link just one more time in the chat. This is our River Citizen program. So we have over 20,000 people from up and down the Mississippi River, across the watershed. There's actually, I think, approaching 2,000 river citizens in Iowa alone. I think it's the state that actually has the most river citizens. And what is a river citizen? These are just people that want to take simple actions, you know, in their lives to make a difference, right? Have a positive impact. And so I'll leave that there for now. We can circle back to it, but I oversee that program with the Mississippi River Network, and it's called One Mississippi. A little bit about me briefly. I actually am not an Iowan. I apologize to admit it. I am upstream here in Minneapolis, Minnesota. I'm already in love with Iowan waters and the people and the wildlife. I did canoe down the entire Mississippi River from Minnesota to Louisiana in 2017. And so I got to really experience the over 300 miles that makes up the Iowan East Coast, right? That is the Mississippi River. I also was able to paddle the upper Iowa River, which maybe we can share more about in this presentation with my now spouse. We did that over 6 days from Lime Spring all the way to the Mississippi. So anyways, yeah, the river runs through my blood. It saved my life 15 years ago when I was in a time of deep, dark depression, and I just started hanging out at the river and just watching it, and really fell in love, and I haven't left, right? So I'll leave it there and pass it off to our next panelist. Great to be on today.
Great. Thanks, Michael, and I appreciate that intro. V, would you like to go next?
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, really, thank you all for inviting me to be here on this panel and this topic. So really appreciate being here and meeting the other panelists as well. My name is V. Fixmer-Rise. My pronouns are they, them, and I am an environmental and community planner. I own SD Planning, which is a planning firm focused on climate change impacts and social and racial justice. And yeah, I have my connections to the water are actually coastal. So I grew up surfing in California. And so it's been, I've been here for over a decade. So it's not new to me that the waters of Iowa. But I've also had several years as a watershed planner here in Eastern Iowa as well. Worked with watershed management authorities and completed the flood resilience action plan for Coralville last year. So yeah, deep ties to the water, super important. I really feel what Michael shared about the emotional connection to water and the life force that is, and how that can be really helpful for mental health. Really feel that. So thanks for sharing that. Yeah, I look forward to the rest of the panel.
Great, thank you. Peter, would you like to go next?
Sure, thanks. Well, like the others, I've been a lifelong fan of water of any form. I'm an open water swimmer here in Iowa. I'm a fisherman, a wilderness canoer, a scuba diver, a sailor. I like to be on frozen water too. I like to ice skate and ice fish. So I partake of water in many different ways, and it's been a passion my entire life. I grew up on a lake in Wisconsin. My professional career is as a professor at the University of Iowa in the College of Public Health, where I do research on air pollution and lung disease, but also climate change and public health. And so the climate change and public health is what brings me to this topic. I teach a course on climate change for undergraduates. I teach global environmental health, and I teach toxicology. And in terms of service, I serve on the Science Advisory Board for the US EPA. And there we deal with a lot of water quality issues. One that's very important right now is called WOTUS, Waters of the US. It's been very controversial, as many of you will know. And in fact, we're meeting next week to spend 6 more hours talking about WOTUS. So a lot of water activity, both professionally and personally, and I'm happy to be a part of this panel today. Thanks.
Great, thank you. And Chuck.
All right, so my name's Chuck Ungs. I'm a naturalist with the Lynn County Conservation Department. I've been conducting environmental education for about 35 years now, with a couple of internships thrown in there. I was born along the Microsystem River, and kind of the most pivotal moment was when I was 9 and moved out to the country, and I had the Microsystem less than 100 yards out my back door. And so, we spent summers wandering up and down the river, fishing, hunting, wading in the river, swimming, seined minnows, captured bullfrogs, caught bugs and tadpoles, sledded, ice fished, ice skate, cross-country skied, all those on the river. Wound up going to Iowa State, and I got my bachelor's in fisheries and wildlife biology. When I did my internship, I discovered what it was like to educate others, and it just lit a fire underneath me. And so I guess today, one of the things that I do is I work to kind of inspire everybody from youth to senior citizens to embrace nature and kind of the world around us, often through fishing, kayaking, even whitewater kayaking. An ACA whitewater kayak instructor. And of course, I live in Manchester. I have the whitewater park is 8 blocks from my house. And in fact, my girlfriend that I met 8 years ago now was the first one that taught me how to roll. She eventually moved from the Quad Cities to Manchester. And so my connections and roots are pretty deep to the river. I also spent a lot of time on the Mississippi River fishing for walleyes and fish quite a bit for smallmouth on the Maquoketa, and do a little bit of ice fishing too. So close ties to water like all the rest of the panelists.
Great, thank you. And yeah, I always enjoy hearing how people introduce themselves and their work and how they got into this work. I think a lot of us have a lot of those formative experiences from childhood or being young adults that really caused us to want to protect and preserve these areas. And you all touched on this a bit in your intros, but I just wanted to start off with a question, kind of an open question to you all. From your perspective, why are Iowa's rivers, lakes, and beaches important? Why do you value water recreation?
I can start us off. I think it goes back to, wanting to be a part of something bigger than ourselves, our human people. We forget that, that we belong to the earth and it does not belong to us. So it's a really good reminder. I also have a 4-year-old and a 7-year-old, and it's deeply important to me that they have a connection that is just outside of water coming out of a tap. Which is important. They need to brush their teeth and definitely take baths and do those things. But just that continuation of caring for and having that connection. So that's kind of a quick touch there.
And recreating in the outdoors is really good for mental health, as we've heard. And it's been interesting that during the pandemic, when we were, trying to be isolating ourselves, one of the things that I could do was swim with my open water swim club out at Lake McBride, and continue to have the bonds of that camaraderie while we did something that was healthful and safe. So it has many benefits for health and mental health.
So one of the things I can add in there, I jotted down a quote from Aldo Leopold, and it was one that many of you will recognize, but it was, "There are some of us who can live without wild things and some who cannot. For us in the minority, the opportunity to see geese or wildflowers is a right as inalienable as free speech." And I think that kind of sums it all up. Water is very important to all the wildlife around us, and of course to us as well. Basically, one of the things that I noticed with COVID was our park just blew up with families coming out and walking their dogs. They rediscovered their pets. And it was kind of a joy to see more folks coming out and visiting. And the nature center that I work at, Wikiup Hill, is along the Cedar River. And so folks that walk the trails far enough can get back and view the river. And it does create calm and help them to stay grounded, I guess is a good way to put it. I did write down just a little bit here. I said, without some little corner to explore and to let imaginations run wild, I'm afraid that the kids of today who are denied access to these places will suffer for a lack of wonder and delight at the contributions of nature. Even more important, perhaps, is that they will never make the connection between our own lives and the ways that nature can help us when we have struggles in our lives. And that really ties in really well with what COVID has actually brought to us on the positive side.
Michael, did you have anything you wanted to add?
I appreciate that. The only thing I'll add is, I think this discussion, you'll find me veering more towards that flowing, that moving water, as Alicia was, commenting on earlier, some of the differences with lakes and rivers. Yeah, I tend to find myself on the moving side of things. And in Iowa in particular, there's such an interplay between the land and water. And these rivers that carve through are in some ways these like remaining strips of wilderness. I think it was you, Chuck, talking about imagination, and you really see that in our waterways, in the rivers. And I think, I have a great book here. I'll just quickly shout it out. It's called Paddling Iowa. It's by Nate from the Iowa DNR. And I was just flipping through it today. And, I think he said it even better. And he said, as much as John Fogerty never saw the good side of a city till he hitched a ride on the Riverboat Queen, you haven't seen the good side of Iowa till you paddled her waters. I'll leave it there.
That's great. Thank you so much. And I appreciate you all bringing literature into this. That's delightful. Tying back to the Alicia's opening presentation, their harmful algae blooms and E. coli are huge threats to our waterways and public health and recreational tourism. But are there other threats to water quality and public health in Iowa's waterways that we should be aware of? There, you're muted.
Thank you. Surface water is a source of drinking water for many Iowa communities, either blended with well water or taken whole and treated. And with a lot of organic matter in the water, we treat it with chlorine and bromine as a disinfectant. And that produces trihalomethanes and other different disinfection byproducts, which are known to be cancer-causing agents. And so the more we have to treat the water in this way, the greater the risk to the public it is, and the harder it is for purveyors of water, drinking water, to make that water safe for consumption.
I'll go next. So one of the things that I jotted down was that the threat that Iowa poses to the world includes our contributions to the dead zone in the Gulf. It should cause us to kind of step back a little bit and to regulate what leaves our state through the water that flows away from here. But shouldn't that also cause us to reflect on the effects of this water on our citizens and neighbors? Big Ag and the stranglehold on our legislature has been aggressive towards environmental issues and pushed hard to avoid requiring Big Ag to provide solutions to the problems they create. Can we name any other industry that gets such a free ride on environmental services that they enjoy? Vote. Speak to others about water and its importance.
Yeah, I really appreciate both of those comments. When I started doing watershed planning, that's really multi-jurisdictional. It's everything from farmers to engineers to, city, county officials. And that scale is certainly important to look at. And you try and understand all of the points at which, what we humans put into the environment that ends up in the water. So like on some level, we're our greatest threat, and if we're not educated, if we're not pushing for legislation, just as Chuck was talking about, if we're not looking at like how our impacts and what we're doing is really only hurting ourselves, that's going to have long-term, and we know that, short-term and long-term consequences. So I would just really echo that. I think it's right on.
Jumping in and continuing on, this idea of the dead zone, right? And I think this gets to the heart of a matter of the concept of the downstream effect, right? And we just no longer live in an era or a time where it's appropriate to dump problems onto our downstream neighbors, whether this is like literally through the waterways moving downstream. The Gulf of Mexico, by the way, that's averaging an annual measurement the size of our eastern seaboard states like Rhode Island, right? This is a massive 5,000 plus square mile issue, dead zone, where animals that can't get out, they die because there's no oxygen is how the processes works there. But I think it also gives, it's also a metaphor of this downstream effect of thinking of the generations to come, right? And so we have the opportunity. V, I love you saying, like, get involved, take action, be a part of the change. And I think that in a time where there are so many overlapping, cascading, catastrophic issues on Earth, it's not an easy time by any means. And and it can be overwhelming. And so I think when we can come back to groups like Iowa Environmental Council, who provides, hey, here's a simple, you can click to email, send, we prepared the action alert, it's going to go right to your representatives. We work with them all the time. We know what to put in the language. You don't need to be an expert. I think there's such a stigma and barrier of who can take action. And a lot of that has to do with, past experiences, education, et cetera, that create these barriers, and so I think the more that we can be curious and look toward different groups that are doing some of this work, like IEC, it doesn't need to be your whole day, right? You don't need to take your whole day and say, oh, I'll take 5 minutes, Chuck just said, right? Clean up some trash, send an action alert, vote. So just really thinking about the actions that we take, must be thought of in an interconnected way.
The other thing I'll add in there is it only takes a few moments to send a contact to your legislators, but every single one of those has a major impact because they have to understand that every single contact that they have represents thousands of their constituents. It matters. Every single chance you get, write and let them know what your thoughts are on what's being done or not being done that should be.
Yeah, I think those are all excellent points, and those are questions we get a lot from folks. And I appreciate the people who are on this webinar today and people who do sign up for our email listservs and follow us on social media. And we try to do, my job is to make this easy for other people to get engaged and be informed. That's if I'm doing a good job, then people have those resources available to them. But that's something, as I go and talk to people around the state, we not only try to explain what the issues are, but also give people tools and empower them to move the needle forward. So I appreciate you bringing that as part of this conversation as well. I want to back up really quickly and talk about HABs just for a moment. Partially, this is an issue near and dear to my heart because I have a lab mix dog. She likes water. She likes gross, scummy water. But Peter, could you talk a little bit about particularly how harmful algae blooms and microsystem are dangerous to companion animals and livestock and pets?
Sure. Well, as Alicia pointed out with the headlines about dogs, we're seeing that a lot. Minneapolis and Minnesota in general has had a lot of pet fatalities in the last few years from harmful algal blooms. Take dogs, for example, they'll go in the water, even if it is scummy, and play in it, and they'll ingest it. And the ingestion is the real problem. Toxins that are in the water, particularly microsystems, are taken into the circulation from the gastrointestinal tract, and they travel to the liver. And without getting too technical, they inhibit liver enzymes that cause a hemorrhagic shock in the animal. The animal can die within an hour, and as we often see. And that's just one of the toxins. There are also other toxins, anatoxin A, saxitoxins. Those, rather than being principally liver toxins, are neurotoxins, and they can cause loss of coordination, convulsions, and death by respiratory paralysis within an hour. So, I think in Alicia's slide, it indicated that these can be chronic liver toxins, but they can be acutely toxic to the liver as well, if particularly when ingested. With regard to livestock, I think most livestock producers are aware that they should not let their livestock go into water that has a harmful algal bloom, but there seems to be less awareness with regard to pets. And so I think we need to be very careful there. The other thing is that these microsystems can be in the water after the harmful algal bloom has started to clear away, and they can persist. And so it may not be obvious that it's not safe for that pet to go in the water. So tracking the data, if you're at one of the monitored sites that Alicia mentioned, or just being aware of the water problems, looking for postings are all important.
Great, thank you, Peter. And yeah, that's definitely one of the more alarming outcomes. And I think something that, it seems to happen so quickly for pets that you can really draw that causal link toward microsystem exposure. But obviously we would have similar concerns for, children or other kinds of exposures for vulnerable people and pets.
And I think we're seeing evidence that people for whom English is not their first language or primary language often are unaware of the hazards and not seeing the postings if there are postings. So we have concern for children swimming in contaminated waters, that even if there might be postings. And so that's another public health hazard that is of great concern.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought that up. And that's something we've actually been talking with the DNR about. At one point early last summer, there was a microsystem advisory for Lake Darling in Washington County. And I went down there, and a majority of the families who were swimming off the beach at the time that there was a microsystem advisory, those families were speaking Spanish, and the signs are not in Spanish. And that's something we brought up with the DNR. Hey, maybe these postings should be in more than just English, so that we make sure folks have the information available to them. And that's, I just talked with DNR yesterday, and that's something they're still looking into, but we're going to keep pushing them on that. They have an environmental justice coordinator now, and they're working on translating several pieces of their communications, including beach signs, but we'd like to see those, this recreation season if possible.
Yeah, and I know some states are putting QR codes on there with translation to multiple languages. So it's a really easy thing to do now. It doesn't all have to fit on the sign.
Right, yeah, that's a great point. I wanted to touch a little bit on, and there's a question a little bit to this point in the Q&A, but just want to touch on outdoor recreation and economic development. How do you see water recreation in particular, and outdoor recreation in general? How does that drive economic development, especially in rural areas? And I know, Chuck, you talked some about the Manchester Whitewater Park, so maybe that you might have some thoughts on this to start.
Sorry about that. I was typing a reply to the answer, but I'm very familiar with Backbone. It's 17 miles from where I'm sitting right now. Spent lots and lots of time there as a kid, used to ride bikes up there. And the biggest issue there is that there's a feed lot, just a little tiny stream feeds into the corner of it, and it's less than a mile away. And until that situation is remedied, I don't think it's ever going to get better. The question that I saw was whether that affects the Whitewater Park. And I think the feeling is that it's far enough upstream that whatever blooms there are at Backbone are filtered out over that stretch. It's a pretty good day's paddle to go from Backbone all the way down to Manchester. I did just speak to some folks over the weekend that had done just that, but I guess my feeling would be that most of the bacteria is gone. Occasionally during the summer, we're usually on the water at the Whitewater Park 2 or 3 times a week. And occasionally you'll have eyes that are itchy the next day or something like that. We always have to figure that, ran into something like that. there's no testing that I'm aware of down here. And of course, one of the points that I kind of had made in planning to answer some of the other questions today were that we only find what we test for. And so some of those are just surprises, but generally speaking, I think we're far enough away. It's not an issue at the Whitewater Park. Hopefully that answers the person's question.
Any other, for the other panelists, do you have other thoughts about, maybe more broadly, the effect or benefits of outdoor recreation for rural economic development?
This doesn't exactly address that, but one issue we do have in Iowa is many rural communities have antiquated wastewater treatment systems. And there's been some efforts to try and provide financial assistance to upgrade those. But what happens is when we have extreme rain events that are becoming more common with climate change, oftentimes they have to completely bypass any wastewater treatment. And so we're putting raw sewage into the surface waters and principally the rivers and streams. So economic development money that can be directed towards improving those wastewater treatment systems can have benefits to everybody who's downstream, and everybody's downstream of somebody.
And I would also add in there that having some resiliency, being able to deal with climate change is pretty important. What we used to do with those water treatment facilities was have them set for a certain level of flow. Well, we've got to adjust our planning a little bit and plan ahead for what's likely to be more of these substantial events.
Yeah, I just want to echo that. Those are very expensive repairs, and and millions of dollars. And so things like SRF funds, we need to make sure that we are funding, at the state level, how rural areas can access those funds and make it easier for them to do so. Oftentimes you're talking about smaller towns that have had, that are they don't have the tax base to cover that kind of expense. So I think really making sure that there's technical assistance, or continuing to make sure that there's technical assistance, especially as we look at climate change impacts and, how our towns and rural areas are evolving, who's moving there and who's moving away. We see a lot of the rural decline continuing to happen. So that issue is only going to get worse, and we can't have those treatment centers, those, wastewater lines, just sitting like that. So yeah, I just really wanted to echo that and note that we need to continue again to make sure that legislators and people who have those funds, access to federal funds, recovery funds, that it is going to simple things like waterways treatment plants and roads, things like, real infrastructural aspects that we know will only get worse.
Yeah, and I think that all makes a ton of sense, and that's something we've been looking at, especially with infrastructure funding now coming from the federal level, is how do we make sure that gets to the appropriate communities, and especially underserved communities or communities that might not have the staff to put in a proposal for those sorts of funding programs and that sort of thing. So those are hugely important issues, and something I wanted to build off from that, and maybe ask, I think, in particular, you've had a lot of leadership in the state and in this space on, having more diverse leadership in water quality and in the environmental space. And I wondered if you wanted to talk a little bit about the importance of new leadership and diverse leadership in the state.
Yeah, it's immensely important. I think I was just touching quickly on, translation of those emergency moments when you're like, can I safely enter this body of water? Of course, you don't know what you don't know. I've traveled the world, and I've certainly been in situations where I was doing something I probably shouldn't have been doing, right? So I think there's some accessibility first off. And I think that if you have people in leadership who are able to recognize that and address that quickly, those types of issues will become resolved. And we can, I think, in terms of encouraging that type of leadership, it's really an incumbent, I think, upon current organizations such as IEC and other leaders who, are primarily white-led organizations to partner with, local organizations that serve people of color or underestimated communities, people with disabilities or, LGBTQ communities, so that we can, and I'm thinking, LULAC or Take a Kid Outdoors or, other organizations that really could, have access to the environment in ways that they don't have access to now, whether that's physically, bringing vans of people to a river, or even just trying to understand, why that's important or how they can fit that into their day. You really have a lot of folks that are working. I mean, just think about all the trauma that we've been through with the pandemic and entire communities that have been left behind with the social safety nets that really weren't there. Some people got federal stimulus, some people didn't. I think there's a real opportunity to try and reach folks and say, hey, like what Michael was talking about, like I was talking about, for mental health purposes, like that's come up a lot. Like, how do we connect to nature? And I think once those relationships are established and that, you're sort of moving at the speed of trust, once you have folks that are like, oh, okay, we've done events together, we've heard you talk, we've done, whatever, we've shared meals together, then I think you can really look at, bringing that leadership on board. It's not going to happen tomorrow. It should have happened yesterday. But we really need to be pacing ourselves in a way that is authentic and not just, propping people up or organizations up because, they're people of color or they're queer or whatever may be the case, because you kind of, there's a tendency to do that. And I just want to caution against that really we need to do the deep work of building trust. I mean, if we look at Native communities, that's some deep work, right? If we look at, communities of color, that's some deep work. So it's something that will take time and investment, I think, from everyone really, but particularly, white-led organizations that are environmental organizations, work at policy level, work at river level, whatever that may be. There's always a point at which you can do that self-reflection and try and understand, how are people, able to reach us? Are we doing the work so that when they come to us, they feel authentically supported? So that it's not a toxic environment that they're being welcomed into, but it's actually an environment where we've really self-examined and said, hey, we're ready. Like, we really are, inviting folks into a place that is safer potentially than it was 10 years ago. So I think that there's a lot of ways you could do it, and we could do a whole webinar on that, but that's just kind of, some bigger picture, but I do think it's possible, and I think people are doing it. So we just need to keep moving forward.
Yeah, I think that's hugely important. That's something that IEC has been really working hard on is diversifying our coalition, and not only, we don't want to be saying, hey, we need to bring more groups to our table. It's not that. It's saying, why are these communities underrepresented, and how do we show up for them, and how do we make this, a safe and accessible and equitable place for everyone. And I don't know if any of the rest of the panelists have any other thoughts on that.
I mean, to follow thanks for everything you just shared, Bea. It's wonderful to hear and just incredibly spot on. Really appreciate you. And for me, a lot of this work, comes back to relationships. And V said authenticity, right? Authentic relationships. And to kind of make a stretch to the river, if you will go with me for a second here, if you just go ahead and go jump out on the Mississippi right now in the flood stage that it is, I don't quite know the exact flood levels in Iowa, but up here it's ripping. It's very dangerous, and you can get hurt, right? And kind of if you were going to reach out to communities of color, or you realize you don't have great representation in your group, your network, your organization, and say, hey, let's prop you up, like V said, let's do all these things, right? You're going to get hurt. Everyone's going to get hurt. You're going to be in the flood. You're going to be underwater. You're going to be in a strainer, and it's just, is not safe, it's not good. And so the only thing that I would add on there is the power of relationships. And I'm so borrowing that going forward, of the speed of, say it one more time. You said the speed of
moving at the speed of trust.
moving at the speed
Yeah.
of trust.
And that's actually from Adrienne Marie Brown, who is a Black queer thought leader that lives in Detroit, and definitely everybody should look her up. I'll put her name in the chat, but yeah, moving at the speed of trust.
Wonderful. Thank you for that. Yeah, we've just been reading pleasure activism with our work team over at MRN. So I'll pass that one along. Moving at the speed of trust. Thank you.
Great, thank you all. And I think we have a few more minutes here. I haven't seen any additional questions come through the chat. I think there is a question here from Todd about, back to businesses having support for protection of waterways and retention and recruitment of employees. I don't know if we kind of touched on that, but I don't know if anyone has any other thoughts on that here in the last couple of minutes. I just want to make sure we answer this, make sure we get all of our audience questions answered.
One thing I would comment on is it seems that compared to many other states, the average Iowan doesn't appreciate good quality water. Maybe they just haven't seen it in a long time. And so I think we really, as companies are competing for workers and communities are trying to keep their young people from leaving, having emphasis on high quality water for recreational use, fishing, swimming, and drinking water is really super important. And I think we need to build a community that understands that the water doesn't have to be the color and the character that it is. It can look much better and be safer.
I don't have any direct information for that question, but I like it. I like the idea of doing that. If we could hit that at a bigger level, I think that you would see some of those cascading benefits. But yeah, we in a capitalist society have to value it. And if we're looking at businesses, then sure, yeah, let's do that. I mean, it's never a silver bullet. It's literally everything we can muster at this point. So I agree with that.
I'll throw in a quick example that is a little tangential from this, but Manchester went through and got the businesses behind removing what was a hazard, a low head dam, and wound up building the Whitewater Park here. And it now adds up to $1 million or so a year, they figure, in funding coming into the city. That's a huge deal for a small town in Iowa. And one of the things that I've gotten from the economic folks along the way is that when a dollar comes into a community, it goes around 3 times before it leaves the community. So imagine the impact that $1 million is having on our local community and those businesses that did buy in and support the notion. As I said before, my girlfriend moved here. I'd like to say I had a little bit to do with that, but also because one of the local businesses was able to hire her on, and she had an opportunity to recreate here in town. It wouldn't have happened without the Whitewater Park. And so, there's one small example anyway, but getting support of businesses in these small towns is very important.
And where's the imagination, right? Where's this creativity? I think just kind of this Manchester as an example, that was a creative solution, right? That came from the community, potentially. I don't know all the details, but just closing with that, solutions are out there. And I think as we can work more and more together in this circle, it's possible.
The other thing I'll throw in there is that the biological advantages for fish being able to migrate have been documented by the DNR. The advantage of having life being able to move up and down that river, and plus the fantastic recreation that I'm able to have here. One of the local police officers counted the number of kids that were playing in the water down there. Soon after we had the park established, and they counted 64 or 67 kids playing in or around the water. You know, those are kids that are not on a couch at home playing a video game. They were having contact with nature. Drives home the importance of having that water be clean enough for them to play in it. It also means that they at least were having some care and concern for the waters that were there. And I think that's huge.
Yeah.
All right, well, we are 1 minute over time, and I want to be respectful of everyone's time, but I really appreciate the conversation this afternoon, and thank all the panelists for your time this afternoon. I think this was a really great discussion, and I appreciate your attention and your thoughts and expertise.
Thank you.
And for those in the audience, if you have follow-up questions or have thoughts or feedback, please feel free to contact either Alicia or me. And with that, have a really great afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much.
Take care.
Thanks. Bye.